Hello everyone, welcome to UGC 112, World Civilizations 2. This is Lecture 15, The Agricultural into the Industrial Revolution. So last lecture we looked at a political revolution in France, and we've seen some before. Remember the Glorious Revolution where William and Mary replaced James II in England. And then this semester we've also seen intellectual and philosophical revolutions with the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. Today what we're going to look at are revolutions in production, starting with the agricultural revolution, which then leads into the industrial. So we start today in the Netherlands, and the name the Netherlands literally means the lower countries, and rightfully so. Only around 50% of this country is more than a meter above sea level. So it's a very, very low-lying country. In the late 16th century, the Dutch began to reclaim some of the land from the sea, and roughly 17% of today's current Netherlands is the result from land reclamation. Two of the main methods that the Dutch used were dikes, which are a type of dam or levee, to hold off water. And here you can see how the land here is actually below the sea level, and that's the dike is holding the sea off that land. And sluices, which are channels with gates that help control water flow. So once the land was reclaimed using these methods, the land itself was very, very salty, right? If much of it is coming from the sea is seawater, salt water, so the land's very salty, and the Dutch had to put nutrients back into the soil. And they did this using manure. That was one of the main ways that they put nutrients back into this reclaimed land. Now, just southwest of the Netherlands, another way of putting nutrients back into the soil was being developed. And this actually dealt with a change in the crop rotation system. Crop rotating is a very, very old practice. The Romans had some sort of crop rotation, and from the time of Charlemagne on, there was a traditional rotation system that looked like this. So you had, on one field, your wheat, another field had like barley or rye, and then a third field you left fallow, meaning you left it alone for a year. So you're getting two different types of cereals by using one field for wheat and one for barley or rye, and then the seasons for growing are a little bit different for those two as well. And the reason why you leave one part of the field fallow is so that you can rest it. Because if you just keep growing cereals, especially on land, you're going to suck out all the nutrients. So that's what you do in one year, and then obviously with the word rotation, the next year you'd put your wheat here, you'd move this one to be fallow, and then your barley would go here. And that's the rotational aspect of it. But the system itself is not highly efficient, right? Because a third of the land that you have there is just sitting there. So you're not using the land to its full potential, since it has to be resting. Now, in the late 16th century, farmers in Flanders, again, just southwest of the Netherlands, their neighbors, began to use 4 fields instead of 3. And in these 4 fields, what they would plant were wheat. So we see our wheat. There's our barley, just like last time, or rye. The third field would be turnips, and then the 4th field would be clovers. So we still have our 2 main cereals being grown, and then turnips were a hardy type of root vegetable that could grow in colder times, often used to feed livestock, but people eat turnips as well. So you get a little bit of diversity in the diet now from this. You get another cold growing crop for, the times in winter when you need some food. You have these turnips that you've grown just before it got very, very cold. And then this fourth field consisting of clovers is especially important. Clovers are a legume which add nutrients back to the soil, especially like nitrogen. And the clovers themselves also help to prevent erosion, because it's not just sitting there, there's stuff growing in it. So, the topsoil isn't being removed by wind or anything like that. And so while this is happening in Flanders, it's being brought up to the Netherlands as well. The Dutch also in the Netherlands made an improvement to the plow, making it more efficient. You needed less oxen to plow with this new type of plow that they improved. The agricultural revolution itself takes place in Great Britain, not the Netherlands. So why are we talking about it, the Netherlands? Well, because of all these changes here in the way that things were being done. But if the agricultural revolution is taking place in Great Britain, how does it get there and not in the Netherlands? For that, we can thank Charles Turnip Townshend. He was a Viscount, which is a pretty high-ranking official in the British nobility, and a member of the House of Lords. From 1709 to 1711, he actually served as ambassador to the Netherlands. And while on that assignment, he was able to see firsthand the new techniques that were being used. These dikes and sluices that have been around, and then the four-field crop rotation that's being developed in Flanders and being brought to the Netherlands. And then he thought that he could import these techniques to his own large estate, which was in Norfolk. And why would he think that? Well, because Norfolk is right here. This is the county of Norfolk. You can see it's pretty much directly right across from the Netherlands. And climate-wise and land-wise, it's very, very similar to the Netherlands. So he thought that he could bring those techniques over, and he did. Using those techniques, he was able to improve his own crop yields, and because he was successful, others copied him in hopes of the same success. Charles Townshend also, he promoted the ideas of especially of the four-field crop rotation, and in doing so, he actually earned the nickname Turnip because, he was such a strong proponent of turnips, and probably their greatest advocate. Not too many people are advocates of turnips, but he was probably the greatest advocate of turnips until none other than Michelle Obama with her "Turnip for What?" There she goes. Oh, let's watch it one more time. It's just so good. Yeah, so there's Michelle Obama. Still pushing turnips, just like Charles Townshend did. So, using dikes and sluices to reclaim land can work in certain coastal areas and marshy lands, like Norfolk, which, again, we see right up here. But what about those poor, unfortunate nobles and large landowners who don't live in a region like Norfolk? Let's say, I don't know, southern, Yorkshire or north or west Yorkshire. How can those poor, large landowners, it's such a struggle owning so much land and being so wealthy already, how can they get more land? They can't reclaim it from any sea. Well, what they're going to do is they're going to find a way to legally take the land. And the land that they take away comes from the common land. Now, common land began in the Middle Ages as land that was owned by the community. And then it could be used by everyone. So here we see there's our three-field crop rotation, right? We see the Lord's Manor there, a little village. Then we see all the stuff called common pasture here. And that's exactly what it was. The common land was used by everyone, usually to, have to help feed your work animals, your horses, your oxen, your cows, and whatnot. So the practice of common land continued on after the Middle Ages, and the idea was even imported to the Americas. Most famously, the Boston Common, which was founded in 1634. And you could graze your cattle or whatever livestock there until 1830, actually, when it was finally outlawed. They had a little bit of a tragedy of the commons, which is this idea that with common land, people will just abuse it and, basically bring it down to nothing. And that kind of happened in Boston. So grazing was banned in 1830, and then, just was kind of a public park from then on. So the way that they legally took this land was through the Enclosure Acts. And these were a series of laws passed by Parliament. And these laws allowed landowners to fence off parts of the common land, and then it became the property of the people who fenced it off. So we could see here, there's some, common land that is now being fenced off into different people's property. And which landowners do you think had the most influence in Parliament? Well, members of Parliament themselves, right? And other large landowners. So, you're not going to be some small little farm owner benefiting from these Enclosure Acts. This is going and helping the members of Parliament themselves and other large landowners. From 1750 to around 1860, up to 21% of the land was enclosed during that time because of the Enclosure Acts. Now, there were some positives from the Enclosure Acts. With all of this land being, fenced off and now being the property of the large landowners, this kind of ensured that all the land was being used more efficiently, right? So there's more land that's being used for farming, meaning that there's going to be a boost in productivity. But the major negative impact was that it kind of made it so that small farmers couldn't make a living anymore. They needed that common land to help, keep their livestock. They relied on that. So they didn't have enough land to have pasture area for them as well as grow enough food for themselves. And at times, these small farmers could also be strong-armed off the land by these large landowners who are getting more and more wealthy by these Enclosure Acts, and then they'd buy up those small farms as the little guys kept on, being forced off the land, basically, because they couldn't live off it anymore. And here's another kind of graphy, representation, I guess, of, before the Enclosure Acts, you could see all the different small little farmers around, and then there's the common land in the darker green, which then kind of gives way to, there's the baron's land, here's a rich farmer's land, and here's another rich farmer's land, and you see no more small farmers really on there, because they just can't make a living anymore. Now, being strong-armed off the land by large landowners was especially true in Scotland. In Scotland, the clans were the ones who owned all the common land, and basically the clans were like these giant extended families. You belong to a clan, and it's kind of like a tribe or something like that. And in Scotland, the chiefs actually forced its own clan members off the land that they had held for, generations. They could force them off by calling in British soldiers, or they could just hire their own thugs to do this. And again, remember, the people that they are driving off their land is basically their extended family. These are people who are members of the clan. They have some, common ground here, but the chiefs really don't care because they can get more land for themselves or for, their friends and whatnot. So here we can see a very aptly named area. This is called Clearance Village in Strathnaver. And, obviously the name Clearance, you can see that it's from the Highland clearances. This is what remains. Now, based on what I said earlier in the lecture, you might imagine that the four-field crop rotation was going to be used on all of this new land. And it certainly was used on some of it. But as the 18th century progressed, the usage of land in Great Britain began to change. After they won the 7 Years' War, Great Britain really started to grow into the world's dominant economic power. You can see here, so this is right after it, 1763, a lot of land they have in North America, now that parts of Canada have been ceded over to them, as well as the eastern part of Louisiana. There's some parts in Africa as well, India, right? And even a little bit in South America. And here we see this is 1815, so just around 50 years later. Obviously the US is gone, but you can see more and more area in the Caribbean. There's Canada still. We see that little bit in South America. India's growing, South Africa, Australia, even into Southeast Asia. And they're just going to keep on expanding. It's a slow, gradual expansion that's going to continue on, and we're going to look at that a little bit later in the semester. But basically from the time of the 7 Years' War on, Britain keeps growing and growing in terms of economic importance in the entire world. And that's because as Britain gained control of these places like Canada, India, Australia, South Africa, Jamaica, these areas created new markets for British goods. There was new demand for them. And what they really wanted was British woolen cloth. Now, the rise in demand would call for a rise in supply, right? That's pretty basic economics that everybody can figure out. The more people that want a product, the more you're going to try to supply it, right? So much of the enclosed land was then being used to raise sheep. Sheep like this Romney sheep, who now is making his second appearance in a lecture this semester. Remember, he was there when we talked about the De Medici in the Renaissance lecture. Here he is making his comeback in the rise of the wool trade during the agricultural and industrial revolution lecture. So good for you, Romney sheep. So they're using more and more of this land to raise sheep, but raising more sheep really only answers the need for supply of more raw wool. People still needed to turn that raw wool into cloth. And that was a long process that involved washing it, combing it, spinning it, weaving it, and dyeing it. So it's a pretty involved process that really hadn't changed much from the earliest days of civilization. Here we can see in ancient Egypt, there's a spinner there spinning here flax, but flax is they're making a different type of cloth, but the process is going to be the same for wool, for cotton, for flax in this case, for linen. So we see someone spinning here, and then we see two people working a loom to weave. Oh, and here's someone else spinning too. The ancient Greeks made cloth in a similar way. Could be wool. And so we can see there's our spinners there, right? Here's our weavers. And now look at this loom. This loom has weights on it to hold, some of the thread tight. And this is actually part of an Etruscan loom weight. So people native in Italy who were greatly influenced by the Greeks, that I found this summer while excavating in Italy. It's a little small piece of one there. And here again we see the production of cloth in the Middle Ages, right? There's someone spinning. There's the loom. Really the process isn't changed much. The loom looks different, but in general this is all human powered. One person at a time spinning that one roll of thread, or weaving that one garment at a time. Now there was a simple machine like a spinning wheel that made spinning a little bit faster. This was invented somewhere between 500 to 1000 CE. But even using the person using the spinning wheel could only make one thread at a time, and it still took about 5 to 7 spinsters to supply a weaver. So a spinster is the one who spins the thread, the weaver is the one who takes that thread, weaves it into cloth. So even if you had more raw materials, right? If we have more raw wool, you don't necessarily make the cloth any faster, because you need more spinsters and more weavers to work as well. So, no matter how much raw material you have, you can only go as fast as the amount of people that you employ, because they can only do one thing at a time. And that is true until we see The Rise of the Machines, which is not a very good movie at all. And my main problem with it, I don't know if any of you have seen any of the Terminator movies, but how is she an upgrade over T-1000? T-1000 was like liquid metal. That makes no sense to me that, she is somehow an upgrade over T-1000. But I'm getting well ahead of myself. We're talking about the Industrial Revolution. We're not even talking about the rise of the machines in that sense. We're talking about the rise of simple machines used for the Industrial Revolution. And one of the major figures is James Hargreaves, who in 1764 invented the spinning jenny. And you might think, oh, the spinning jenny, is that named after his wife? No, it's not. Jenny is just a way of saying, it's like a nickname for machine, right? You call a machine, because it's machine, a jenny. So, not his wife's name or anything, but just a nickname for machine in general. And he supposedly got this idea for this machine when he knocked over a spinning wheel and saw that different parts of the spinning wheel could move at the same time. Using this invention that he made, the spinning jenny, one spinster could now make 16 rolls of thread. And that's a huge upgrade over, the one roll of thread that someone could use using a regular spinning machine. So with this new spinning jenny, one spinster can now make 16 rolls of thread. So you're basically, multiplying your production by 16 times. 4 years later, in 1768, Richard Arkwright invented what was called the water frame. Now, you may think that's a funny name for a spinning machine, but it gets the name because it was in fact water-powered. So water frame kind of makes sense. And using this machine, one spinster could make 128 rolls of thread at the same time. So this is a massive improvement. just 6 years before, if a spinster was going to make a roll of thread, they could only make one. Now, if they're sitting at this machine that they're in charge of, they can now make 128 rolls in the same amount of time that it used to take to make one. And this machine was especially useful for making like a strong industrial type of yarn. Not very great at making fine, delicate thread. Around 1779, a man named Samuel Crompton kind of combined the spinning jenny and the water frame to create what he called the spinning mule, or what came to be known as the spinning mule. And this machine is really the one that takes off during the Industrial Revolution. It's kind of taking all the best aspects of the spinning jenny and the water frame together. So it's a very, very good machine, but the reason why it especially takes off was because Crompton was not able to patent the machine. So basically, anybody could use that design, right? And many used this design without having to pay him at all. Later in life, Parliament did give him £5,000 for his contributions, but £5,000 in, around 1800 amounted to basically $400,000 today, which is nothing to scoff at, but compared to the amounts that people were making off of his design, isn't even the tip of the iceberg of what he probably should have earned for his invention. One good thing about this machine was that it could produce a very, very fine thread, which could make even softer and softer cloth. So like I said, the best parts of the spinning jenny and the water frame combined together. So now with these three inventions, we see a rise in the supply of thread. But again, so just like we saw with a rise in the supply of raw wool, now we have the growing supply of thread, but what about the growing supply of cloth? Because weavers still have to work that thread into cloth by weaving it, right? Well, Edmund Cartwright was the man who sped up the production of the final product. And he did this when he invented the power loom in 1785. Now, the power in the name power loom came from water power, just as Arkwright and Crompton's machines. And here we can see actually his second design for a power loom here on the right. And Cartwright didn't just speed up production in this way. He also further sped up production when he created a wool combing machine in 1789. And this would help take the raw wool and turn it into something that could then be spun faster. So this was like a middle ground between raw and thread, right? So he's helping out on both ends, both through the finished product with the power loom and that step between raw wool and spun thread with this combing machine. And this here actually is not Cartwright's design. This is one that, was improved. This was one that was influenced by Cartwright's and design and, improved upon. Cartwright himself also would invent a steam engine that used alcohol instead of water, but we're kind of getting a little bit ahead of ourselves when we're talking about steam, because these early machines are based on water, and like I said, he'll invent a steam one using alcohol instead of water. But let's look at water power first. As we mentioned, as time went on, these machines used hydropower. They were powered by water. Using water as a power source was actually a pretty ancient practice. Romans used water power when they had water mills to grind grain, and the Han Dynasty in China used water to power pumps, so they could pump water into fields and whatnot. So water mills were not, or water power was not anything new to say. But during the Industrial Revolution, we see this ancient power source being reapplied now to textile machines and on greater scales than the Romans or the Han Dynasty ever used them. And the benefits of this revolution in power is that it's not human power, right? Humans can grow tired, they can get fatigued and sick, and, sometimes their attention isn't always there. These machines could now go 24/7 with just people watching over them, right? And they were also more efficient just by the fact that they could do so many things at once, right? Like we said, the spinner after Arkwright could be in charge of 28 rolls of thread at the same time when before they could only do one. So these are not only going at 24, they can go at 24/7, but they're also more efficient. And this efficiency made it so that many spinsters and weavers who practiced the traditional way of spinning and weaving could no longer support themselves. Water power does have its limitations, though. For one, you needed to be near a source of moving water, and not all places have that. I'm originally from Tucson, Arizona. I really can't set up a water mill in Tucson, Arizona in the middle of the desert because there's just not, enough moving water and enough water that moves fast enough to push machinery. So geography is a little bit of a limit there. And also water power is subject to the weather, right? A drought could lower the amount of water that's flowing. And the same can be said for the exact opposite. Like if it gets really cold and there's a deep freeze, that also will stop the water from flowing. So you slow down your machines that way, or maybe they're not even moving at all without the water power, because of the droughts, because of a freeze. So water power was definitely an improvement over human power, but a better source could still be there, and a better source was definitely desired by people who started to own more and more factories that housed these machines. And that power source would be steam. Steam power was also used a little bit during the Roman times. Hero of Alexandria, one of the greatest inventors of all time. He was a Greek inventor in Roman Egypt, so a Greek who's living under Roman control in Egypt, invented quite a few contraptions that used steam. The most impressive probably is the use of lighting an altar. So here's the altar outside of the temple. So you light it up, that creates heat, which then goes down into the tank, and that heat then makes this water into steam, which then was used to open doors to the temple. So when you light this altar, you get these doors opening, and there's the cult statue of the god. So that's kind of neat, right? Because lighting the altar is a way to show that you want to pray to the god. It's a way of praying to the god. So when you do so, those doors reveal and the god is there in your presence. Pretty neat. There's also, little spinning toys things. A very impressive man, Hero of Alexandria. He also invented the first wind-powered musical instrument, among many other things. Unfortunately for humankind, his inventions were viewed more as novelties, and the Romans were a very conservative people. They never applied any of these inventions or the principles of them to production. If they had, imagine where we would be today if, let's say, the Romans were doing this in, the year 200 or 150, and then we had had the Industrial Revolution then. Just imagine where we could be. But that didn't happen. Instead, they just were kind of viewed, like I said, as novelties, little fun trinkets, and not used for production. So we had to wait for later people to come along and, find the true use of steam for production. And one of the main figures here was Thomas Savery, who invented the first commercially used steam engine in 1698. And it was used to pump water out of mines and to pump water to help fight fires. There was one chamber that gathered the water, and in general, it was a highly inefficient machine. It helped for those certain situations, but it took a lot of energy to, make it useful. So it's very inefficient. The benefits aren't obvious there. It has its specific purpose, but you can't really see any extended benefits from it. Then came Thomas Newcomen, and he improved upon Savery's design by adding an atmospheric chamber, and that's what this right here is. This helped create a vacuum that drove a piston. There's the piston being driven. But this design, definitely an improvement upon Savery. He actually got the idea of this through a Frenchman who saw the value of pressure cooking. He's made the first pressure cooker. Thomas Newcomen takes these French ideas for cooking and steam principles and adds it to Thomas Savery's steam engine, and you get this this new engine here. But there's still a problem. In order to create the vacuum to drive that piston, the cylinder walls here had to be cooled down. So you heated it up, right, to make the steam, and then you had to immediately cool them down to suppress, to create that vacuum to drive down the piston. And in order to heat and cool down and reheat and cool down and reheat, it took up a lot of energy to make this steam to drive this machine. So, still inefficient. Whereas Savery's design was very, very inefficient, this one is still very inefficient. But this remained the best option for steam-powered pumps and fire engines for about 60 years or so. And that's when a man named James Watt, a Scottish inventor, came around, and he improved upon Newcomen's design. He was actually hired to help fix Newcomen's engines that were at one of the local universities, and he noticed how inefficient it was. And what he did to make it more efficient was he added the idea of a separate condenser chamber, and that's this right here. So we see that main atmospheric chamber is just going to stay hot, but you're going to suck away the heat and have it in a condenser chamber here. So without having to cool down the atmospheric chamber, the efficiency went through the roof. By 1775, when he had put the final touches really on his machine, and he began to install them for for businesses and whatnot, his engine used 75% less fuel than Newcomen's. So through James Watt, steam power was finally efficient enough to be used more regularly and to be seen as a viable option for different industries than just pumping water out of mines or as a firefighting tool. And to that purpose, Watt's financial backer, a man named Matthew Boulton, was the one who convinced Watt to make machines that replaced this piston. Well, there was still the piston that drove everything, but to replace a certain aspect of the machine, that instead of just making it so that things got sucked up and sucked down, it could rotate instead. And the idea of not having to be limited to just, up and down, but instead rotating made steam power more applicable, especially for things like mills that could grind grain, or textile, right? Spinning thread or weaving. So the machines that had been hooked up to water power now had steam power adapted to them. And once steam power was adapted to these uses, it really became the driving force of the Industrial Revolution. Now, factories could run 24/7 anywhere, right? It didn't matter if you were near a stream with a steady supply of running water. You could be in Tucson, Arizona, and have a factory that could run 24/7 because you had the steam engines. This would lead to more and more efficient means of production, but in turn, that meant that many people practicing the old methods of, spinning and weaving, or other industries that were becoming adapted to steam, or that had steam power adapted to them, that meant that those people who were practicing those old ways lost their means of living, right? Just like today, you can't really bring back certain industries that some people really want you to, because those industries just don't exist anymore, right? Things have become so automated. Today, it's the same, right? There are just certain industries that are so automated that you don't have the same factory workers that you did in, say, the 1950s. This is the same idea, where you had people practicing the old method of spinning and weaving, just not being able to live or make a living off of that because those jobs didn't exist anymore, because they were being replaced by these factories that were, producing hundreds of times faster products, or products faster than the people who were using the traditional way. And that leads us to the question, what would happen to all of these people who are being displaced by the growing Industrial Revolution? And that is what we're going to see in our next lecture. So stay tuned for that. This is Greg signing off.